Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start thanking the authorities of the Federalism and Freedom Foundation for distinguishing myself with the Alberti Award. It is a pride for me to be deserving of such a distinction, and it is a pleasure to be present once again here in Tucumán, the land of our maximum hero and father of our first constitution, Juan Bautista Alberti. In particular, I want to recognize the Foundation for having supported me and provided a space of expression for so many years, even when the liberals were very few and defending freedom was considered a heresy. Today, in part thanks to the work done by foundations like this, Argentina has the first libertarian liberal president of the history of humanity. I also want to take advantage of this afternoon to reflect with you about three pillars that have been characteristic of our government: the power of truth, the power of the macroeconomic order, and the power of freedom. Starting with what we call the power of truth, if there is a reason why I arrived in president, despite not having governors, mayors, or media related to my party, it is because I always preferred to tell an uncomfortable truth about a comfortable lie. Moreover, during the presidential campaign, all the media set up against me, inventing endless lies and barbarities to try to scare me with their power. What they never understood is that, as Latin says, veritas vincit, the truth always triumphs. Because lies at first can walk, but they have short and comfortable legs that are sooner or later end up failing and collapsing, like a castle of cards. In our country, we witnessed how a repeated lie until the media fed up made a citizenship that ended up kicking everyone. Despite the operations against, we won the elections thanks to the voice of the people on social networks, which for each lie responded with two truths. This is a very interesting topic, and we were suffering in the campaign. In fact, I remember that the first advisor I had asked me if I had dead in the closet. I looked at my sister and said, "I don't think I have any dead in the closet." Then, he told me that, well, that for 2 months I was going to investigate and I was going to look for the dead in the closet. After 2 months, we have a meeting and tells me, I have two news, a good and a bad one. The good was that they had not found anything. The bad is that, since they had not found anything, they were going to invent it. And so we had to endure a lot of lies throughout the campaign. All kinds of slander, insults, squeeze, threats. But the interesting thing was that, every time they did an operation, at first a certain amount of time lasted, and the next operation lasted less, and the next one. And in the last stretch, we saw that the operation suddenly lasted, for example, hours. So, in that sense, the reality is that the truth always triumphs, and also, as Mises said, which uses a phrase from Virgil, that we must not give in to evil, but that it must be faced with much more strength. I think we did that, and thanks to that we could reach this incredible situation of having won the elections with mass support, and that fortunately we can say that we are not disappointing, because each of the campaign promises are complying with them. Therefore, once in the government, we were faithful to these same principles and resisted attacks after attack of journalists, politicians and mercenary economists who seek to make us fall with lies. They said that we did not pass the step. They said that we had no structures. They said that we were not going to be able to compete. They said that we were third. They said that we had lost the debate. They said that we were not going to be able to govern. They said that adjusting more than 1 point of the GDP was impossible, that achieving fiscal balance in the first year was impossible, that ending with the pickets was impossible, that taking into mate. They got tired of saying that everything we proposed was impossible, but they never understood that with the truth of our side, politics is not the art of the possible, but in making possible the impossible, and we are doing it. The second aspect has to do with the power of fiscal order and an orderly macroeconomy. Precisely the second power I want to talk about is that of the power of an orderly macroeconomy and tax austerity. To understand where we were, when we assumed the inflation rate, it came in December running to 1% daily, something that annualized is 3,700%. If you passed to the second week of December, it had accelerated to such a point that the annualized was already in 7,500. And when you take the wholesale inflation, which is the one that anticipates, the one that runs ahead, reached 54%. That 54%, if you annualize it, gives 17,000%. And the reality is that one can say, well, but that extrapolation, does it make sense? Well, it makes sense as long as you have elements that monetarily validate that. So if you validate it monetarily, it can happen. Then we would have to see what monetary problems we had when assuming. In principle, as any case where you have a fixed exchange rate and where, in addition, there is an unbalanced fiscal policy and money is issued and prices are attempted, you generate a gap. The gap became at 200% levels, that is, the difference between the official and parallel exchange rate was a 3-to-1 relationship. But not only was that problem, that was a way of showing the type of monetary left a television program, which says that I arrived without plan. I came more than 10 years ago saying what had to be done in Argentina, what is precisely what I am doing, incidentally. In fact, the other day I saw that there was a tweet from a liberal named Ivan Carino, who just what I was proposing was to tell what I said in that book, because it is precisely what we are doing. So I did not hear what Ivan did, but I suppose that, if he is going to tell the book, but he advanced that we were already doing what was said there. And another thing, for example, the monetary surplus we had at the time of assuming was twice as much as we had in the previous one to Rodrigazo. And Rodrigazo was a situation that caused the inflation rate to multiply by 6. That is, it came at levels of 30%, jumped to 180%. We received inflation above 200. But, in addition, not only that, but multiplied the poor by 5. If we took the last official fact that was poverty, I lost meaning, because they no longer gave the numbers for a linear extrapolation of those characteristics, because there is a limit that is 100%. But what happens is that we had twice as an imbalance that Rodrigazo, therefore, only with that there was already underlying inflation of 2,400, 2,500%. that, if the demand for money falls to the equilibrium level, when you know that when you have hyperinflation or an inflationary acceleration of these characteristics, the demand for money will fall very strongly. In fact, in Alphonsine hyperinflation, the demand for money became 0.2% of GDP. Therefore, we also did not put it in the calculation, but we knew that, in addition, it could not happen, but that it was going to happen. Not only did we have that problem of a tremendous money overhang, which had implicit multiplying the inflation rate by 12 or 15 times, but we also had another problem in that the previous government had passed all the remunerated liabilities, which were on average to 90 days, a week after assuming they passed them to 1 day. Therefore, we, in 1 day, could multiply the amount of money by 5. As if all this were not enough, we had debt maturities in pesos for the equivalent of $90,000 million. Therefore, in that context, imagine what would have been, or there was a default, or there was an explosion of pesos that generated hyperinflation. If there was default, we also had the problem of the SIRA, which were about $43,000 million, and the trapped dividends. Therefore, we had a problem in addition to currencies generated by the previous government of more than $50,000 million. Net negative international reserves. Therefore, if we instead of behaving as libertarian liberals we would have acted as liberated liberals, which are many of those fools who put the label in the cock, and they give recommendations that would have set fire to the country. Without going any further, the greatest stupidity was said by Hoppy's imbecile, where he said, "No, the easiest thing was to close the central bank, and it was forgotten that it is forgotten, that it is forgotten, that it is forgotten that monetary theory did not realize that monetary liabilities, if you do not honor them, zero. That means that the price level goes to infinity, that is, hyperinflation." If we had had a hyperinflation, which was what the outgoing government wanted, they would have made the typical Peronist tactics about the holidays, generating looting and others, and in January the Kirchnerism returned to eternalize in power, or at least kill liberal ideas. Therefore, sometimes it is not free to put aside the restrictions that one faces. Therefore, with all these elements that were to enhance the evolution and feed the price rise, 17,000, I would almost tell you that they were making prices if that happened. But not only that, but we also faced a fiscal imbalance of 15 points from GDP, 5 in the national treasury and 10 in the central bank, with the aggravating fact that the 10 of the central bank generated endogenous broadcast. And we who understand inflation as a loss of the purchasing power of money, we consider that inflation is always and in every place a monetary phenomenon, generated by an excessive supply of money, either because the supply rises, because the demand falls, or because both things happen at the same time, which generates a loss of the purchasing power of money and, therefore, prices rise. Under that situation, what we had to do was cut the monetary issuance, and to cut the monetary issuance, which the previous government had issued to finance deficit for 13 points of the GDP, it had to be cut with the fiscal deficit. I remember that, when I said that we were going to adjust, for example, in the Treasure 5 points, they said that it was impossible, that no one could do, that there was no way to do such a thing, which could be done in no way, that at most you could lower a point per year. In fact, the International Monetary Fund, which we had the Fallen Agreement, with which we reached the goals of the Fallen Agreement, reached them. And in fact, they could not believe that we were proposing an adjustment of 5 points of the GDP by 2024. And there, with the courage of all my team and especially by the Toto Caputo team, the central bank commanded by Santiago Basili, we started this work of ending the fiscal deficit, and already in the first month of the year we reached the fiscal balance. First they told us it was because we were lying the numbers, then because it was transitory, after at some point we were going to give in, which were then going to take us. Today I will confirm that the year 2024 Argentina closes with fiscal balance in the financial line. That is to say, what seemed impossible we made it possible, and that huge and talented man who is Luis Toto Caputo, who criticized him, noted, belittled since we assumed, the best minister of economy in the world was chosen. What if we succeed? On the other hand, our strong commitment to fiscal policy and budgetary balance allowed us to gain confidence in the markets. I remember that when we won, the country risk was in 3000. When we assumed, it was in 1900. And the point is that the fiscal balance, in the financial line, makes one do not have to take debt. And if one does not have to take debt, that the GDP moves, and with what the population grows, the debt-product relationship is decreasing, and, therefore, one is solvent. And that allowed two things. Not only that today the country risk is below 700 basic points, specifically it is 665. But also this situation allowed us to clean the balance sheet of the central bank. And while everyone said that we had to raise the interest rate, which would have led us to a much more explosive situation in terms of paid liabilities, inflation expectations, and, therefore, they would have been talking about the carry trade every day, and we would have glued the pineapple of the century. We were convinced that the interest rate was not the mechanism to do monetary policy. We were convinced that what had to be done was to control the amount of money, and for that the fiscal deficit and the fourth fiscal one had to close and we lower the interest rate. And the most interesting of all this is that with the passing of the months, we could go cleaning the balance of the central bank, and in 6 months we finished cleaning the balance of the central bank. It means that in 6 months of government we made an adjustment of 15 points on GDP, that is, we made the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity, and that resulted in a fall in the inflation rate. The wholesale inflation rate of the last month was 1.4%, that is, we went from traveling to 17,000 to travel to just over 15, but not only that, if you consider that we have a 2% crawling of 2% in international inflation, that gives about 2.5% monthly, means that Argentina today, if it were not for the induced inflation of the crawling peg, Argentina has a monthly deflation of 1%. But not only that, because you could tell me, well, but I don't care wholesale inflation, retail inflation. Well, retail inflation, the last data was 2.4%, almost in line with induced inflation. But the reality is that this number is contaminated, because we are recomposing rates. So what happens? When you look at inflation in goods, it was 1.6% and that of services, very impacted by rate settings, was 4.4%. Therefore, there is a part of the inflation that is explained by the tariff recomposition of the disaster made by Kirchnerism, the regulated companies bursting. Therefore, inflation would be traveling at 1.6, and if the rest the induced means that we are also in a deflation of 0.9%. That is, today Argentina travels at a rate of a deflation of 1% monthly, that is, annual. To have an order of magnitudes of what we did, if one takes it in terms of food, it is less than 1%, and if it takes it in terms of the basic food basket, it is a little more than 1%. And if you look at it in terms of total basic basket, it is around 1.4. This means that, given the growth that wages have been showing since the economy touched an apartment there from March to April, real wages not only have been growing because wages earn at the price level, but also in terms of poverty and indigence, we are obtaining very important results. So, the point is, and how does poverty go? I do not know if they are aware, but today data was published from a study conducted based on the INDEC methodology by the institute that looks at the problems of income distribution at the University of La Plata, and that are aligned with what the UCA calculated and that today the Ministry of Human Capital reported. The poverty of the first quarter, which was in 54.8%, the poverty data that was known today is 38.9%. And the homelessness, which in the first quarter was 20.2%, today fell to 8.6%. That is, even having made the greatest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity and said that the level of economic activity was going to be destroyed, the recession ended between March and April. From there, the economy is expanding at a rate of 10% per year. When they take the GDP of the third quarter, 3.9% expanded, that is, the economy has been expanding at an annual rate. They said that inflation fell because consumption was destroyed and consumption has been growing at a rate of 20% per year. They said there would be no investments and investments are flying to 50% per year. Therefore, we have shown that the best way to get people out of poverty, the best social plan to get people out of poverty is to exterminate inflation and grow again, from the fiscal balance and an orderly monetary policy. Therefore, what they said that we could not do it possible in 3 quarters, because they are data from the third quarter. But not only that, when we look at the story, there is a wonderful job of 3 economists, Gerardo Della Palera, Bozzoli and Irigoyen, named Passing the Buck, and what he does is take the macroeconomic pressure index developed by Mudd. If I tell you that I got a hair in my eyes, they will believe it for sure. The management has left me less hair, but I still have enough. Basically, the macroeconomic mud pressure index applies, and with that compares all the governments of Argentine history, and the Menem government, Menem's first government, was the best government in history. And when one takes the first Menem government, or if they want to take the full period, I say, because the second was third in the ranking, they are not believed that it was far behind. Menen's program had two characteristics: had a stabilization program, which was the convertibility plan, and had a set of structural reforms. If we look at the numbers that we are obtaining today, we are obtaining aligned numbers. In terms of time dynamics, although we start above, today we are at levels to the months of those of us of the convertibility, but we achieved this without a previous hyperinflation such that the real balances were liquefied and the stabilization was easier. We did it without expropriations because there was no Bonex plan. The solution of the balance of the central bank was made by market roads, to the extent that the interest rate was lowered, in a coordinated phenomenal work between the president of the central bank, Santiago Basile, and his team, and that huge professional that we also have in the Ministry of Economy, that is Pablo Cuerno. With which, we also solve the problem to the market, which is not less, and less for us as liberals, the issue of respect for property right. On the other hand, unlike other stabilization plans, which the first thing they did, before announcing the plan, they recomposed rates. And they replied basically and then show a leap of inflation, and that later, when the stabilization plan began, deceived people with which inflation lowered less. I never had it in a folder to do something like that, but I'm going to be honest, I didn't have an alternative to make it different. That is, we acted fast or we got on. That is why it is funny to say that we had no plan, because if we had not had a plan, we would have flown through the air. But that is not all. Unlike other programs, and especially convertibility, we do not set the exchange rate. And we also don't set prices. And notice that this is interesting. That is, we did not do price control, nor did we set the exchange rate, and we today, if we cleaned the induced inflation, we would be in deflation. That is to say, that our program is better in the field of stabilization than that of convertibility, which had been the most successful economic program in the history of Argentina. But not everything ends there, because the Menem government made structural reforms, and we, only with 15% of the deputies and 10% of the Chamber of Senators. And now I am going to thank all those who are not of Freedom Advance and support it strongly, such as Governor Jaldo or Governor Jalil, whom I greatly thank you, or the governors who belong to Together for the Change and for the work that the deputies have done in this. We made the largest structural reform in Argentine history. We made a structural reform 8 times larger than that of Menem, which is the sum of DNU 70, plus the base law. Therefore, I have no problem affirming that we are the best government in Argentine history. I also want to recognize the fundamental contribution of the block of deputies of the PRO, who also worked a lot with us, help us a lot, which is led by Christian Ritondo, who is now being the victim of operations and persecutions precisely for helping us and collaborating. And that, although we have started from different spaces, today he finds us every day closer to this ideological rearrangement I talked so much for years. I always said that politics owed Argentines an ideological rearrangement, that on the one hand, those who defend the ideas of freedom, and on the other hand, collectivists, that they get the mask, and all those who are willing to defend the ideas of freedom, we are going to hug them and we are going to get together with all of them who want to defend the right to life, freedom and property. Because hugging the ideas of freedom, Argentina will be great again. In this sense, there is also recognition of the increasingly large group of radicals, which over the months have added this reformist project that came to change Argentina. I am sure that society will recognize those who supported the change unconditionally, of those who sought excuses to hinder it, which gives me the foot to talk about the third power. This is the power of freedom, in all its forms. With all the reforms that we have made of Argentina amounted to about 70 positions in the ranking of economic freedom in less than a year. Why is it important? We recurrently, when we defend freedom, we're always running, well, and how it works, and we know that epistemologically that some accounts look good on paper, but then in real life they are more complicated, but it is a good inference of the effects of the ideas of freedom. See the indexes of economic freedom. And there one sees that those countries that are freer are 12 times richer than repressed. In terms of per capita income, they also have 25 times less poor in the standard format, 50 times less in the extreme format. Therefore, to embrace the ideas of freedom had to be a great business, that is, there is no more powerful mechanism to get people out of poverty and that it progresses to embrace the ideas of freedom, but of course, it has resistance from those who live that people are not free. And not only that, we have climbed 70 positions in terms of economic freedom. We went from being in the platoon of the worst 35 to being in the middle squad, and obviously for us this is not enough. That is why on the one hand I have a colossus of deregulation minister, that is Dr. Federico Sturzenegger, who basically made him a calculation that he takes out some regulations at a rate of 1.8 per day. But the reality is that they did it in annual terms, and Federico's ministry started in the middle of the year. Therefore, it takes about 4 regulations per day, which helps lower costs, to make us more competitive, to gain freedom. And, in addition, we have 3,200 pending structural reforms. Therefore, my commitment is that, when I leave power in Argentina, Argentina will be the freest country in the world. In turn, the power of economic freedom was evidenced very quickly, given that when approved the regime of incentives for large investments, investment announcements in the country were fired. Notice that we already have RIGI orders for about $15 billion in ads in terms of $60,000 million. And to think that there were some who said that this was not going to work, just those who destroyed the capital and those who also UF to destroy capital. Therefore, this was the most full evidence that when the state runs from the environment and stops biting where it does not correspond to it, trade and prosperity flourish, generating employment where there was not before. In fact, they said we were going to generate a brutal unemployment, the last unemployment data, with real wages growing. That, by the way, when we assumed the basic salary was $300 and today is $1,100, the last data shows that the unemployment rate fell to 6.9%. The truth is that I do not know what the Keynesians are going to dedicate, the structuralist of the Keynesians, the heterodox and all that sleeve of beasts that lived ruining the life of the Argentines for almost 90 years. So well, I imagine that they will burn their credentials or become liberals. And this is extremely important because it allows us to glimpse that the future of Argentina will be auspicious if we continue along this path. I'm going to tell you, and I promise that I get out this time and again, and I don't get out anymore. Days ago I was lucky to talk to a series of brilliant economists, and within those brilliant economists, I was lucky to talk to Professor Juan Pablo Nicolini, a doctor at the University of Chicago. At some point he was a rector of Di Tella. He assumed as rector and I was graduating from the mastery. And we found ourselves because he published an article that was very interesting to me, where he showed that, using a series of mathematical structures designed by Robert Lucas Jr., that in peace rests, he showed that Argentina reaching the fiscal balance could systematically grow to the 4.5% per year. For example, in basically, we can upload our GDP per capita by 50%. Not only that, but then we began to talk about the situation of Argentina. The same part that we talked about Argentina was the shortest part. Later we dedicated ourselves to discussing economic theory, especially about Keynes. But, apart from that, the interesting thing is that what Professor Juan Pablo Nicolini mentioned is that this was fiscal balance, only fiscal balance. This means that there was no distinction if this was based on adjusting the expense or raising taxes. And we, as liberals, know that this difference is fundamental. I say, because the Soviet Union could also have balance, right? But there was no freedom. So, it means that, because of the type of adjustment we made, where basically the largest part was in the financial system, the fourth fiscal, where the banks did not work for banks. They took the silver from the private sector to give it to the state, therefore, they did not work for banks, they were accomplices of a thief who is the state. But not only that, but also, of what has to do with the adjustment in the Treasury. That adjustment in the Treasury that implies a 5-point adjustment. More than 5 points were more than 5 points, were 7 points. And that differential we apply to give containment to the most vulnerable and rebuild retirement. In fact, today the retirement are above, in real terms, of which we receive in 2023. And, in addition, if they take them in dollars, it is more, that they doubled. But not only that, but also the previous government lived by showing its containment to the poor, and between the feed and the AUH card, they covered 50% of the basic food basket. And we, thanks to the task and huge work of Minister Sandra Pettovelo, today we cover 100% of the basic food basket. Therefore, it should not surprise that the number of homeless people in Argentina has gone from 20% to just over 8%, because it was precisely a deliberate plan of the economic team and obviously from Minister Sandra Pedovello that, in addition, as if all this were not enough, with a joint action with Minister Bullrich and with the then Minister of Infrastructure, Guillermo Ferraro, they also managed to end something that seemed impossible in Argentina and is to end pickets and poverty managers. At the same time, to be clearer, I think I am clear, but to be clearer, we seek to free trade, because we understand trade as a peaceful tool that makes enemies and clients and competitors in collaborators. Trade blurred borders and joins enemy peoples. Trade causes the client to decide and thus submits companies to healthy competition, in which they prosper inventiveness and the process of collective discovery that, in effect, end up generating wealth and taking people out of poverty. Now a long thing is the last one that I leave the script well. It is that we are a government that, if you look, I made a report with Susana Jimenez, and at one point Susana Jimenez asked me how we were going to go, if we were going to leave. What reflection could you leave? And I said, they have no doubt that from now on they only come good news. Well, what I did not imagine is that they were so many per day. And a few days ago I had to assume the presidency of Mercosur, the pro-tempore presidency, and there I raised 3 issues for Mercosur. One that has to do with the fact that we work together against drug trafficking and terrorism, and 2 issues in terms of commerce, that we lower what has to do with Mercosur itself, that we lower the common external tariff, and that we eliminate the paraarancelaria barriers. Because the truth that, just as Mercosur as much would not be working. But there is a third line, which seems to me that it is the most important, and I am proposing that member countries, we can negotiate independently free trade agreements with other countries of the world. And in that sense, I have said that we are going to work in Argentina to achieve a free trade agreement with the United States, and what seemed like a chimera, today. One of the men who works with Donald Trump said he is on the agenda to advance on the agenda of freedom with Argentina. And it is for this reason that, the truth, we are not enough for us to occupy the 70th position in the Economic Freedom Index. And that is why we want to become the freest country in the world, so that capital moves freely in our country and we are an example of prosperity and growth for posterity. In fact, to achieve this, we have 3,200 pending reforms for the coming years. That is, they have no doubt, we will make the country the freer in the world. Naturally, returning freedom to Argentines is not a company exempt from costs and risks, because it necessarily implies privileges and benefits to politics, their friends and customers. That is why we set an increment adjustment on public spending, and this is reflected in all government agencies. Videos more seen in the world is, guess which one, outside. In fact, the number of ministries that were in 18 took it to 8. We eliminate secretariats, undersecretaries, addresses. We eliminate organisms that were dedicated, for example, to ideologically pursue those who did not commune with the left, such as the Ministry of Women, or the INADI. Because if they want to truly end the femicides, it is not fixed with songs and scarves, they are fixed by applying the law. And so we eliminate public works, which we eliminate discretionary transfers to the provinces. Not only that, but we lower public employees, eliminate the contracts that overcome and those who did not have a specific task. We lower the salaries of the officials. In fact, since we assumed, we have not increased the salary when we could have done it, and not as they did in the Senate. A fairly different situation with what happened in the Chamber of Deputies, where Deputy Martin Menem, president of the chamber, applied a large number of cuts so that the benefits and privileges of politics are finished, which do not help people, but who only make politicians rich. But, in addition, we also ended with a curro that everyone knew that there were people, except for the work of the trusted funds. We eliminate more than 15 fiduciary funds. And, in addition, we eliminate a lot of boxes from politics from the moment we assume. And so we continue every day, eliminating deficit wells and regulations of all kinds. Although those who live from those boxes resist. All this, what was achieved, however unfriendly our first measures were, we have not lost an apex of support to the population, which changed the chirp policy mentality for a true future projection anchored in growth. And here I want to stop to talk about you. As I highlighted a while ago at the beginning of the presentation, the role of the foundations such as the cultural battle that we provide day by day, because the ideas of freedom spread. We, in fact, say that we work in three ways. We work the management route, we work on the road and work in the cultural battle, and understand that the cultural battle is fundamental and as important as the other two. If not, notice the left being always and in an entire place an impoverishing and murderous phenomenon, because we never forget that they killed 150 million human beings for that stupid idea. However, they have been politically successful because they won the cultural battle and we when the wall fell in 1989, when in reality the true fall of the socialist system applied at its end in real life. It actually fell when they had to build it in 1961, when it was first only bars, some wires and others, then the wall was finished. The reality is that if with that history and that thorough record, they were successful, look at everything we could have done if we had given the cultural battle we did not give. Therefore, we are deeply committed to the cultural battle, because we know how to manage, how to generate wealth. We are waking as politically, and if we give the cultural battle as appropriate, we will undoubtedly have 100 years of liberalism, and Argentina very soon it will be a world power. That is why, in fact, there are a number of videos about my person, and it is very interesting, because my first television appearance is from 2014. It is here, in Tucumán. It is here in this place, invented by this foundation. And in the background, incredible, it was violet color and said, starting point. That is, without a Federalism and Freedom Foundation inviting Malay to speak so many years ago, there would be no Malay president today. Thank you, Federalism and Freedom Foundation. That is, not only that federalism and freedom was my starting point, they also gave me the prize for the defense of freedom, and today they give me the Alberti Award. Thank you, they are exaggerating already, thanks. And this is why it is essential that ideas can continue to have these spaces dedicated to restore common sense, which today seems to have nothing. Because the left, after so many years of showing power, developed a propaganda arsenal from which our ideas undermine. But our ideas triumph even with a bad press. They triumph even when 13 points of the GDP are broad submit to your regime. They triumph in each citizen standing that a journalist in networks who are lying. Triumphs in each entrepreneur who seeks to evade the bureaucracy they impose to subjugate it. Because our ideas respond to the cheerful and thriving spirit of our humanity, and those respond to the sorrows of small souls who want to control and submit the other to feel superior, and joy, in the long run, is always imposed on sadness. Not for anything, not for nothing. My screen protectors many years ago, they say Antef, joy has an end. Obviously, if one is liberal, joy has an end, because he understands how the world works, and when one understands how the world works, he becomes happy. Liberalism is a path to happiness. In addition, they saw how the socialists' life is. It is horrible. But well, they are based on envy, hate, resentment, on the unequal treatment in front of the law, on murder. That is why they have gray lives are more or so garbage, they are so filthy, they are so disgusting that they appeal and regret that we do well. They cry because inflation lowers, they cry because GDP rises, cries because real wages rise, they cry because poverty goes down and because the living conditions of Argentines improve, because the ideas of shit they have are losing. On the other hand, we also have to know that at the speed that these ideas have to impose depends on us. That is why we cannot afford to fall asleep in our laurels. We have to take advantage of the wind in favor to raise the candles liberalism and grow as we have never done. I am going to tell you an anecdote. I said that I was not going to divert me, but I think they will like them. In the last cabinet meeting that we had planned to take to the team a survey set that we follow, with some regularity, because you always have to know where the temperature is. And looked at the numbers and all the numbers were incredible. So I said, I just have to give good news. This is a danger. So what did I do? I have a chainsaw. I really have several that have given me, but I have one that I have directly in my office at Casa Rosada. So, as it is really very heavy, I made it take to the Eva Peron Hall, which is where we have the cabinet meetings, and put it at the table where we met with the cabinet. So when we were at the meeting, obviously they were arriving and were surprised. The chainsaw we looked at. At one point we started, and when we started I began to give all the synthesis of numbers we had. And the truth that this, either in terms of image, in terms of management, in terms of support the different policies and in a series of relevant issues to take into account where we are standing, were all good news. Then I pointed to that wonderful set of professionals who accompany me, that above all things are also excellent people. I told them that we were as in a football match winning 2-0. 2-0 is an extremely dangerous result, because if you trust you can turn the game. Therefore, it was a moment of knife between the teeth and to put a strong leg without stopping. And the way to put the leg stronger in this is with more chainsaw. And that is why at this time not only Dr. Sturzenegger is working on what are the deregulations, but also working on what is called the deep chainsaw, Weather, by the way, has just been copied by Japan, has had the interest of Elon Musk and Vivek in the United States and Donald Trump himself. In fact, Federico also contacted Giorgia Meloni. The other day in the German parliament they asked for chainsaw to Malay. And at this stage we go to what is the deep reform of the state, where it does not reach us with the fact of having reached 8 ministries. We still want to compact that structure and continue advancing to gain economic freedom. And therefore, as I said before, we cannot sleep in our laurels. We have to take advantage of these winds and take advantage of them because we have wind in favor. Therefore, sowing today the seeds of the new world, thinking about what fruits we want our children and our grandchildren to collect. Remember that when we arrived, our children and our grandchildren, all they thought was to leave, today stay, and many are already returning. Wow, things have changed. That is why we need to form leaders and evangelizers who take the idea of freedom to every corner of sea. They are taking it the whole country. Look at the future vision they had. And I ask a question, and why don't we think about taking it to the entire world, right? That is no more or less to echo the most precious good that humans have, which is freedom. No. In that sense, we also have a clearly defined international policy. Moreover, no one could say that I did not say what I was going to do during the campaign. No, because in the field of fiscal policy I said that I was going to happen to the chainsaw and arrived. In monetary politics I said that we were going to end the central bank, going through a currency regime of currencies that called it dollarization on television. But it is the competition of coins, and I do not know if they are aware. But today in Argentina there are competition. You can make your transactions in the currency that you want. Today, they can not only bill in pesos, you can invoice in dollars or the currency you want. Because we are enabling coins competition. Therefore, every day we are closer to moving towards the endogenous dollarization and at the end of the road, closing the central bank. But not only that, we had to fix the disaster left by cockroaches. No. I say, because the wreck-off we made at the central bank was $45 billion, and in the middle, we also bought $25,000 million and the Kirkirism, which always so much eufana that the debt lowers and raise the debt to the crazy. We have dropped the debt by $35,000 million. Well, the ideas of freedom work. And also, in terms of security, we said that we were going to sweep insecurity. And what the Bullrich minister is doing a huge job, a phenomenal job. See what happened to the flag plan in Rosario. Homicides down 70%. We said we were going to end the managers of poverty and ended with the managers of poverty. Go if Minister Pedovello works well. And in international matters, we said we were going to align with the United States and Israel, and that is what we did. And when the previous chancellor, in a vote, voted in favor of Cuba, was on the side of the whole world and on the other side was the United States and Israel, that was not my policy. And just as I had no qualms about throwing my best friend, in 30 minutes I threw the chancellor and I have another chancellor. Because here we do not come to make friends here, we come to save Argentina, defending the ideas of freedom. And that is why the defense and the role of defending Israel and Israel, because deep down, the bases of free business capitalism are also in Jewish culture. That is, those who study the Torah will see that the bases are there. Moreover, you have Weber's work on Protestant ethics. That is no more, or less, than also rescue, from the side of those who believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, but also rescue the teachings of Judaism. And that is what builds the basis of our capitalist system. That is why Israel is not only attacked by its enemies in the region, Israel is continuously attacked throughout the international left, because they know that, if they break Israel, they break the values of the West, and with that capitalism, and they will be able to advance in the collectivist agenda. Therefore, beyond what they can accuse me about my preferences, defending the Israel cause is to defend a fair cause because it is the cause of freedom. But we also have to know that a lot is still missing, that they have been educating in society for 80 years. So we have 80 years of disadvantage. The good thing is that we have the promising fire on our side, because they need us to survive, and we only need ourselves. Therefore, entrepreneurs cannot be indifferent in this dispute, and no matter how much they have them actively. And the truth is that, when they have to play on the right side, not on the side of the Lord fiscal deficit and financing of 13 points of the GDP. Because we have already learned that the cost of not getting involved is too high, and that any outstanding idea of a fiscal degenerate will always end up financing with our pockets. Therefore, and to finish, I invite you to get to work, because the cast is not going to make the suitcases and go home. You cannot pretend that they leave alone, that is, they will hold on with nails and teeth to this mastodon that we are trying to break down, and the more we are, the faster we are going to lie down. Look at, I usually use a phrase that is, you can go to a match in Argentina, go to the court, you look at the color of the stands is fabulous. The songs, the entire previous ceremony, during, it is something truly a show in itself. Not for nothing the most important sports show in the world is Boca River on Boca Court. It means that Argentines with football have a very particular mystique. And we also have the best football player in history, of all time, which is the greatest of all, which is Lionel Messi. Now, you put the ball in the middle and the fans can shout everything you want, but do you know what happens to the ball? It does not move. That is, if you want to win the game, you have to get involved. You have to put the shorts, you have to put the booties, and you have to start kicking. He does not fix himself fucking from the gallery, and much less throwing stones at his own. That is why there has to be division of labor. We have to understand that the cultural battle is not only in an office, in a desk, but it is also in the field of politics. You have to enter and you have to play and you have to go and win on the court. And in that sense, what they have to do is get involved, and those who are dedicated to being in the desks try to understand the restrictions faced by those who make decisions. I remember that in one of the dinners I have in Olivos with several friends, the table is always headed by Professor Juan Carlos de Pablo, with whom I always had an excellent relationship. And when I had my conversion and I became anarcho-capitalist, because I am still anarcho-capitalist, that is, I do not forget I have to face a reality, where there are things that I do not like and some I can change them, others do not, but I remain an anarcho-capitalist. I still think that the state is a criminal, violent organization that lives from a coercive source of income called taxes. I consider that taxes are a remora of slavery, and that is why I work all day to try to reduce the state more and more, so that we win more freedom. And then I began to have differences with the teacher, because it seemed like how it could be that such a bright guy seemed that he was condescending to politicians. More when he had spoken with all the ministers of economy and presidents of the central bank of at least the last 50, 60, 70 years. And then life reunited us and we had a much better link than we had before. And being in Olivos one day, in front of the whole group of friends that we gathered to see operas, in front of them, and I repeat this so it is public, I apologized to the teacher of Paul for having angered me at that time, and I told him that I now understood why his analysis seemed contemplative. It is not that they seemed contemplative. When one is sitting in the electric chair, there are many more restrictions that are seen on the outside, and that he also has. He has a reflection that is brilliant, because he says, "You truly are a genius, that there was a problem. That is, the first question is, why do you think Malay, Caputo, Basili are so bullshit that they don't see it? That would be the first obvious question, if you think you don't see it. But suppose that you are indeed so genius that you see it and you don't see it anymore. Then at some point that will be known, it will come to light. So what do you think these three can do at the moment that appears? Discover that there is a problem. Well, the first is, they leave. It is not in the character of these gentlemen. It is not clearly, because if they had not grabbed this hot potato, and once you find out, what do you think you will do? Does neglect, do nothing, or are they going to do something? And yes, they will do something. So, the point here is to understand that one makes decisions with many restrictions and that sometimes it is not that one does not see the situation, but that what happens is that it has to contemplate a set of restrictions that when one is sitting in the electric chair is larger. Even so, back, we did more than what all the previous ones did in more than 123 years. If they do not look at the issue, if there is something that is core is the fiscal balance. And we in the first month of the government reached balance in the treasure. At 6 months in the consolidated, Argentina of the last 123 years had a deficit in 113, and in the 10 that had no deficit it is because it did not pay the interests of the debt, because it was in default. Therefore, look if we are breaking the limits of what was considered impossible. Therefore, what I suggest is that we get involved, that we put ourselves, that we give the fight, and for those who decide a position not on the battlefield, not in the trench, and prefers to do it from a different place, because people not all have the same preferences and the same talents, that those who carry it on the desk understand that what we are in the battlefront have some additional restrictions. Without more or less than all this, they have very good night. May the forces of heaven accompany us, and long live freedom, damn it. Thank you so much.